The snow had been falling since midnight. It fell without wind straight down from a sky the color of old iron, each flake small and dry and patient. By dawn, the world had gone quiet in the way only deep snow can make it quiet, muffling every sound except the creak of tree branches bending under weight and the occasional soft thump of snow sliding from a pine bough to the ground below. The cabin sat small against the mountain smoke rising gray and steady from its stone chimney, the only sign of warmth for miles in any direction. Inside, the fire had burned low during the night. The main room held the blue darkness that comes before true morning, cold enough that breath made small clouds in the air. The stone fireplace took up most of one wall, its mouth large enough for a man to stand inside if he bent his head. Beside it, stacked with care, were split logs of pine and aspen, their cut ends showing rings that told of years and weather. The floor was pine as well-worn smooth by feet, and time covered here and there with woven rugs that had once been bright but now showed only muted reds and browns. A table stood near the window, two chairs tucked beneath it. A bookshelf leaned against the far wall, its shelves holding perhaps 20 volumes, their spines cracked and faded. In the corner, barely visible in the dim light, hung a small cross carved from cedar wood, suspended by a thin strip of leather from a nail beside the window frame. The man in the bed stirred as the gray light grew strong enough to reach his face. His name was Josiah Wade, and he was 45 years old, though the mountains had a way of making a man look older or younger, depending on the light and the season. He sat up slowly, the blanket falling from his shoulders, wool thick and heavy woven by hands that were gone now. He wore a flannel shirt, even in sleep, and his feet found the cold floor without hesitation, as if his body no longer expected warmth first thing in the morning. He crossed to the fireplace in 4 strides. The room was small enough that 4 strides took you most places. He knelt before the hearth, his knees cracking once, and looked into the coals. Red still buried beneath white ash. He reached for the poker, its iron handle cold against his palm, and stirred the ash gently. The coals beneath glowed brighter, and he added kindling from the box, thin splits of pine that caught quickly. The fire whispered as it woke. He added a log, then another, and sat back on his heels to watch the flames take hold. The light grew, yellow and orange and moving, casting his shadow large against the wall behind him. He watched the fire the way some men watch water, seeing things in it that were not there but also were. The cabin warmed slowly. Heat rose from the hearth and spread outward in layers, pushing back the cold 1 degree at a time. His breath no longer clouded. He stood and moved to the stove, a cast iron thing with 4 burners and an oven door that hung slightly crooked. He filled the coffee pot from the water bucket, added grounds from the tin, and set it on the stove to heat. While the coffee brewed, he stood at the window and looked out at the snow. It had stopped falling sometime in the last hour. The sky showed lighter now, a pale gray that meant the sun was up there somewhere behind the clouds. The snow lay smooth and unbroken across the clearing in front of the cabin, maybe 8 inches deep, maybe more. The pine trees beyond the clearing stood dark against all that white, their branches heavy, their trunks black and straight. No tracks, no movement, just the snow and the trees and the silence. He breathed in. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee beginning to boil. He breathed out. Steam no longer just breath. The cabin settling around him, its timbers adjusting to the warmth. Small sounds like conversation. A creak here, a pop there. The fire talking to itself. The coffee boiled. He poured it into a tin cup, the steam rising thick and bitter. He did not add sugar or cream. He had neither. He carried the cup to the table and sat in the chair that faced the window and drank slowly, letting the heat of the cup warm his hands, letting the bitterness of the coffee wake the parts of him that were still sleeping. Outside, a branch released its burden of snow. The white mass fell soundlessly to the ground, and the branch sprang upward, bobbing twice before going still. He thought about the day ahead. There were traps to check along the creek maybe a mile from the cabin through the snow. There was wood to split, though he had enough for today and tomorrow. There was the barn to visit, though the single horse he kept needed little more than hay and water. These were the tasks. They filled the hours. They kept him moving. And when they were done, there was the evening and the fire and the silence. 8 years, 8 winters he had lived this way, 8 times watching the snow come and cover the world, and then watching it melt away in the spring. 8 times alone. His wife's name had been Sarah. He let himself think it, just the name, just once in the morning. Sarah. She had been small and dark-haired and quick to laugh. She had loved this cabin, though it was rough and far from everything. She had made curtains for the windows and planted herbs in a box by the door and carved that small cross from a piece of cedar he had brought down from the high country. She had died in the winter not from childbirth or violence or anything dramatic. She had simply gotten sick, a cough that would not leave, a fever that would not break, and one morning she had not woken up. That was all. The mountain took her the way it took everything eventually, quietly and without asking permission. He had buried her in the spring when the ground thawed on the hill behind the cabin where the aspens grew. He had carved her name into a piece of slate and set it at the head of the grave. He had not carved dates. She had not been a woman of dates. She had been a woman of seasons and weather and the feel of things. The cross still hung by the window. He looked at it now, the wood smooth from her hands, the edges rounded, the proportions simple and true. She had given it to him the spring before she died, not as a gift for any occasion, but simply because she had made it and wanted him to have it. He had hung it there, and it had hung there ever since, through 8 winters and 8 springs, watching the snow come and go. He finished his coffee and stood. The day would not make itself. He pulled on wool socks, then boots that came to mid-calf, worn leather, but still sound. He put on a coat of canvas lined with sheepskin, its collar high and stiff. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, pulled a hat low over his ears, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a wall, clean and sharp and so intense it made his eyes water. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots breaking through the crust of snow, and closed the door behind him. The world stretched out white and empty. No sound but his breathing, no movement but the smoke from his chimney. He stood there for a moment, letting his body adjust, and then he stepped off the porch and began walking. But he did not walk toward the creek. He did not walk toward the traps. Instead, he walked south through the deep snow toward the town. It was 7 miles to Pine Ridge, most of it downhill, and it would take him 2 hours or more through snow this deep. He had not planned to go to town today. He had not planned to go to town at all this month. But something had been growing in him for the last week. Something quiet but insistent, and this morning when he woke, he knew he would go. The snow made walking hard. Each step sank 8 inches, sometimes more. His thighs burned after the first half mile. Sweat gathered under his coat despite the cold. But he kept walking, his breath coming heavier, now his body finding the rhythm it needed. He followed the trail by memory more than sight. The snow had covered everything, but he knew where the path ran, where it turned, where it crossed the frozen creek on stones that were now hidden beneath ice and white. An hour passed. The trees thinned, the land flattened. He could see the valley below now, and in the distance the small cluster of buildings that made up Pine Ridge. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, thin and gray against the white. The town was waking. He reached the edge of town just before 9. The main street had been walked enough that the snow was packed down easier going. A few people moved between buildings, bundled and bent against the cold. They nodded to him as he passed. He nodded back but did not stop to talk. He was not a man who stopped to talk. The post office sat on the corner, a small building of rough-cut lumber, painted white, its door facing the street. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Warmth hit him first, then the smell of paper and ink and tobacco. Behind the counter stood an old man named Hewitt, thin and spectacled, sorting letters into boxes on the wall. Hewitt looked up. "Morning, Mr. Wade. Morning. Did not expect to see you today. Roads are bad. Came on foot." Hewitt nodded. "Got something for you, actually. Came in yesterday on the stage." He turned and retrieved an envelope from one of the boxes, glanced at it, then held it out. "From Denver. Looks official." Josiah took the envelope. The paper was thick cream, colored, the address written in careful script. The return address showed only a street in Denver, in the words Sisters of Mercy. He turned it over. The seal was unbroken. "Thank you. You want to read it here? I can get you coffee. I am fine, madame." He tucked the envelope into his coat and turned to leave. "Mr. Wade," he stopped, looked back. "Everything all right up there? You need anything?" "I am fine," he said again. "Thank you." He stepped back out into the cold. The envelope sat against his chest, strange and foreign. He did not know anyone in Denver. He did not know any nuns. He walked to the end of the street and stood beside the livery out of the wind and opened the envelope carefully. The letter inside was a single page, the same careful script. He read it slowly. Dear Mr. Wade, my name is Mother Superior, Teresa of the Sisters of Mercy Convent in Denver. You may not remember me, but 3 years ago, you delivered a load of timber to our chapel when we were rebuilding after the fire. You would not accept payment beyond the cost of the wood. You said it was for the work we do. I am writing now because we have a sister in need, and I remembered your kindness. Sister Mary Catherine has served with us for 7 years, working in our hospital and teaching our children. She is 28 years old, strong in faith and spirit, but 6 months ago she developed a sickness of the lungs. Our doctor says the city air is making her worse. He says she needs mountain air, clean and cold, if she is to survive. I know this is much to ask, but I wondered if you might have room in your home for her this winter. She would require little, a place to sleep, food to share. She can cook and sew and tend to herself. She would not be a burden. We would provide what money we can for her keep. If this is not possible, I understand. But if it is, please send word. Spring may be too late. With gratitude and prayer, Mother Superior Teresa. He read it twice more. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though whether from cold or something else he could not say. He folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and stood there in the silence looking at nothing. A woman, a nun, sick and needing the mountain to live. He thought of the cabin, 2 rooms both small, the main room with the fire and the table and his bed in the corner. The back room, even smaller, that had been Sarah's workroom, where she had kept her sewing and her herbs and the small things she collected. He had not opened that door in 8 years. The room sat cold and empty and untouched, a space held apart from the living. He thought of Sarah, what she would have said. She would have said yes without hesitation. She would have already been preparing the room, already planning meals, already making space. She had been that way. Open, unafraid of change or strangers or the complications that came with helping. But Sarah was gone, and he had built his life around the absence of her, around the silence, around the solitude that did not demand anything of him except that he survive one day and then the next. He stood there for a long time. The cold seeped through his coat. His feet grew numb in his boots. The letter sat against his chest, waiting. Finally, he walked back to the post office. Hewitt looked up as he entered, surprised. Need to send a telegram, Josiah said. Of course. Hewitt pulled out the form and a pencil. Where to Sisters of Mercy, Denver. He dictated slowly, Hewitt writing each word. Room available. Sister Catherine, welcome. Provision sufficient. We'll meet stage Christmas Eve morning. Wade. Hewitt counted the words, calculated the cost. Josiah paid from the small leather purse he kept in his coat. The coins were cold and heavy in his palm. You sure about this? Hewitt asked, looking at him over the spectacles. No, Josiah said, but send it anyway. He walked back through the town past the church and the general store and the houses with their windows glowing warm. He bought flour and coffee and salt enough for 2 people through the winter, and he carried it all on his back in a canvas sack up the mountain to the cabin. The walk took longer going up. His legs were tired, the sack was heavy, but he kept moving step after step, his breath white in the cold air, his mind working through what needed to be done. By the time he reached the cabin, the afternoon light was already fading. He dropped the sack inside the door and stood in the main room, breathing hard, his body hot under the coat. The fire had burned down to coals again. He built it back up, then lit the oil lamp on the table. The room filled with yellow light, warmer than it really was. He looked at the door to the back room. Pine like the floor with a simple latch. He had not touched that latch in 8 years. He crossed the room and stood before it, his hand on the wood. It was just a room, just 4 walls and a window and whatever Sarah had left behind. That was all. He lifted the latch. The door swung inward. Cold air met him, the smell of dust and time. He stepped inside. The room was smaller than he remembered. A single window faced north, its glass gray with dust. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its frame simple and sturdy, the mattress bare. A dresser beside it, 3 drawers all closed. A shelf on the wall held jars of dried herbs, their contents long past any use. In the corner sat Sarah's sewing basket, the lid closed, the wicker pail with dust. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold and the stillness. Then he turned and went to work. First, he opened the window to let in fresh air, cold as it was. Then he stripped the mattress from the bed frame and carried it outside to beat the dust from it. It took longer than he expected. Years of dust do not leave easily. But eventually the mattress showed its true color again. A ticking of blue and white stripes, faded but clean. He brought it back inside and laid it on the frame. He found sheets in the chest at the foot of his own bed. White linen folded carefully, smelling faintly of lavender. Sarah had put lavender in everything. He made the bed, slowly tucking the corners, the way she had taught him, smoothing the wrinkles with his rough hands. He found a quilt wool and heavy its pattern, simple squares of blue and gray, and he spread it across the bed and stood back to look. It would do. It would more than do. He swept the floor with a straw broom, the dust rising in the lamplight. He wiped down the dresser and the shelf, removing the jars of herbs and setting them aside. He would throw them out later. He cleaned the window inside and out until the glass showed clear the view of snow and pines, sharp and cold. The room looked different now. Not Sarah's room anymore. Just a room. A space waiting to be filled. He closed the door and returned to the main room. The fire burned steady. He sat at the table and ate a simple meal of bread and cold venison, chewing slowly, thinking about the days ahead. Christmas Eve was 4 days away. 4 days to finish preparing. 4 days before the stage brought her up from Denver. 4 days before the silence ended. He thought about what the letter had said. Sister Mary Catherine, 28 years old, sick with the lungs. A nun who needed the mountain to live. He tried to imagine her but could not. In his mind, all nuns looked the same, small and dark and hidden beneath habits, their faces pale and solemn. He did not know if she would be strong enough for the mountain, for the isolation, for the cold. He did not know if she would be frightened of him, this stranger she had never met, or if she would be grateful, or if she would simply be resigned to whatever fate the sickness in the convent had given her. He did not know anything, and yet he had said yes. That night he lay in his bed and listened to the cabins settle around him, the fire crackling low, the wind rising outside, pushing against the walls, finding the cracks and singing through them, the window rattling gently in its frame. And somewhere in the darkness, barely visible, the small cedar cross hanging on its leather cord, turning slowly in the draft, casting a shadow that moved across the wall like something alive. He breathed in. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. He breathed out. His breath was warm in the cold room. He thought of Sarah briefly, the way he allowed himself to once each night. Her small hands on that piece of cedar, the knife moving carefully, the curls of wood falling away. She had always been patient with small things. She had always believed that care mattered even in the smallest acts. He closed his eyes. The exhaustion of the day settled into his bones. His body relaxed into the mattress, his breathing slowed. Tomorrow he would split more wood. He would check the traps. He would make sure everything was ready. The snow fell again that night, softer than before, adding another inch to what already lay on the ground. It fell on the cabin and the barn and the grave on the hill. It fell on the trail that led down to town, and on the town itself, covering the streets and the roofs and the stage station, where in 4 days a woman would arrive who knew nothing of mountains or silence or men who lived alone. The cabin held 2 heartbeats now instead of one. The fire and the man, the warmth and the life. The mountain leaned close, watching, waiting, patient as stone. Morning came gray and cold. Josiah woke to find frost on the inside of the window, ice crystals in patterns like ferns. He built a fire, made coffee, ate bread with butter he had churned himself the week before. Then he dressed in his warmest clothes and went out to split wood. The axe was heavy and sharp. He set a round of pine on the chopping block and swung. The blade bit deep and the wood split clean, falling in 2 pieces to either side. He set another round and swung again. The rhythm took him. Lift, swing, split. Lift, swing, split. His breath came harder. Sweat formed under his coat. But his body knew this work. His muscles remembered. He split wood until the pile was twice what it had been. Enough for a month, maybe more. He carried it armload by armload to the covered porch and stacked it carefully, the pieces fitting together like a puzzle. When he was done, his shoulders ached and his hands were sore despite the calluses. But the work felt good, necessary. It was something he could control. The next day he baked bread. He was not skilled at it, but he knew the basics. Flour, water, salt, a bit of sourdough starter he kept in a crock by the stove. He kneaded the dough on the table, his large hands awkward with the soft mass. It took longer than it should have. But eventually the dough felt right elastic and smooth, and he set it to rise near the fire. While it rose, he cleaned the cabin more thoroughly than he had in months. He swept every corner. He scrubbed the table and the floor. He washed the windows and beat the rugs and aired out the blankets. The work took most of the day. By evening, the cabin smelled of lye soap and fresh bread, and he sat at the table exhausted, eating a slice still warm from the oven butter, melting into the crumb. On the third day, he rode down to town on his horse, a bay mare named Lucy, who was steady, if not fast. He bought supplies at the general store, more flour cornmeal, dried beans, a slab of bacon, coffee, sugar tea, and a small tin of honey. The storekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Garrett, raised her eyebrows at the quantity. Expecting company. Mr. Wade, yes. She waited for more, but he offered nothing else. Finally, she nodded and wrapped the goods in brown paper and string. He paid and loaded everything into the saddlebags and rode back up the mountain as the sun dropped behind the peaks to the west. That evening, he sat by the fire and thought about what to say when she arrived. He was not good with words. Sarah had been the talker. She had filled the silences with stories and observations and questions that made him think about things he would not have thought about on his own. Without her, he had grown even quieter, his days passing with almost no speech except to the horse or to himself. But this woman, this Sister Catherine, she would need something from him. Reassurance, maybe? Welcome. Some sense that this cold cabin on a frozen mountain was a place she could survive. He did not know if he could give that. He did not know if he had it to give. He looked at the cross again hanging there in the shadows. Sarah's hands had made it. Sarah's faith had shaped it. He had never been a man of faith, not in the way she had been. But he believed in care. He believed in doing the next right thing, whatever that was. And right now, the next right thing was to open his home to someone who needed it. Christmas Eve came cold and clear. Josiah woke before dawn and dressed carefully. He wore his cleanest shirt, his best wool pants, his good coat. He shaved for the first time in a week, scraping the blade across his jaw by the light of a candle, wiping the soap away with a cloth dipped in warm water. He looked at himself in the small mirror that hung by the door. A stranger looked back. Older than he felt. Harder, but clean. He saddled Lucy and rode down to town, arriving just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, flooding the valley with thin gold light. The stage was due at 9. He tied Lucy to the post outside the general store and waited. The town was quiet. A few people moved about preparing for the holiday. The church bell rang once, calling the faithful to early service. He did not go. He stood by the horse, his hands in his pockets, watching his breath cloud in the cold air. The stage came late, as stages often did in winter. It rolled into town just past 10, the horses blowing hard, their coats steaming. The driver climbed down stiffly and opened the door. 2 passengers emerged. The first was a man in a black suit, a traveling salesman by the look of him. The second was a woman. She was tall, taller than he expected, taller than most women he knew. She wore a simple gray dress, modest and plain, and a wool cloak the color of charcoal. Her hair was pulled back, severely covered by a white coif that marked her as a nun. Her face was pale, her cheeks hollowed by sickness or hunger, or both. But her eyes were clear, gray like the winter sky, and when they met his, they did not look away. He stepped forward. Sister Catherine. She nodded. Mr. Wade. Yes. They stood there for a moment, sizing each other up. She was young, younger than he expected, and there was something in the way she held herself straight, despite her obvious exhaustion, that spoke of strength beneath the frailty. The driver handed down a single bag, small and worn. Josiah took it. Is this all? Yes, she said. I travel light. He tied the bag to Lucy's saddle. The horse will carry this. We will walk. It is about 2 hours. I can walk. They left the town behind and began the climb. The trail was packed from his earlier passage, easier going than it had been days before. Still, it was uphill and steep in places, and he could hear her breathing grow labored after the first mile. But she did not complain. She did not ask to stop. She simply kept walking one step after another, her boots crunching in the snow, her breath coming in white clouds. They did not talk. There seemed nothing to say, or perhaps too much, and so they walked in silence, the horse following behind, the sun climbing higher, the air cold and still. Halfway up, he stopped at a wide place in the trail and let her rest. She sat on a fallen log, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the sun. He watched her from the corner of his eye, this stranger who would share his home, and he wondered what she was thinking. If she was afraid, if she regretted coming, if she understood what the winter would be like. After a few minutes she stood. "I am ready." They walked on. The trees grew thicker. The trail narrowed. The cabin appeared suddenly, as it always did, small and solid against the white landscape, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin line. "Here," he said. She stopped and looked. For a long moment she said nothing. Then quietly, "It is beautiful." He had not thought of it as beautiful. It was just a cabin, just shelter. But hearing her say it, he saw it differently, the way the logs fit together, dark and weathered, the way the roof held the snow, the way the smoke rose straight in the still air. Maybe it was beautiful. Maybe it had been all along and he had simply stopped seeing it. He led her inside. The fire was burning. He had built it up before leaving, and the room was warm, the light golden. She stepped in and stood just inside the door looking around. He set her bag down and waited. "Your room is there," he said, pointing to the door. "I cleaned it. There is a bed and blankets. It should be warm enough." She crossed to the door and opened it. He watched her face as she looked inside. Something passed across it. Relief, maybe? Or gratitude? She turned back to him. "Thank you, Mr. Wade. This is more than I expected." He nodded, unsure what to say. "I can cook," she said, "if you show me where things are." Later, he said, "You should rest. The journey was long. I am not so fragile as I look." He almost smiled. "I did not think you were." That evening they ate together at the table. He had made a simple stew, venison and potatoes and onions, thick and hot. She ate slowly, carefully, as if her body had forgotten how to take in food. He ate in his usual silence, watching the fire, listening to the wind pick up outside. When they finished, she helped him wash the dishes, heating water on the stove, drying each piece with a cloth. They worked without speaking, finding a rhythm. And when it was done, she looked at him and said, "I will not be a burden, Mr. Wade. I promise you that." "I know," he said. And he did. She went to her room, then closing the door softly behind her. He sat by the fire alone as he had every night for 8 years. But it was different now. The cabin felt different. The silence felt different. There was another heartbeat in the walls, another breath in the cold air. The cross hung on its cord, turning slowly, catching the firelight. He thought of Sarah again briefly. Wondered if she would approve. Wondered if this was what she had meant when she told him in those last days to keep living. Not just surviving, living. Opening the door when someone knocked. Making space. Caring even when it was hard. He stood and banked the fire for the night, covering the coals with ash so they would hold until morning. He blew out the lamp. The room fell into darkness except for the red glow from the hearth. He lay down on his bed, pulled the blanket over himself, and closed his eyes. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft and steady and silent, covering the world in white. Covering the tracks they had made, making everything new. The cabin breathed around them, holding two souls now instead of one. Two people who did not know each other. Two people brought together by sickness and kindness and the mountain's cold mercy. The fire crackled. The wind sang. The cross turned slowly on its cord, casting shadows that looked like wings. And in the darkness, Josiah Wade thought for the first time in 8 years that maybe the silence was not something to protect. Maybe it was something to share. Christmas morning came quiet and blue. The sun had not yet cleared the peaks to the east, but the light was there, cold and thin, turning the snow outside the windows into something that looked almost like water, pale and luminous. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to ash and a few stubborn coals that glowed red when the wind found its way down the chimney and breathed across them. Catherine woke to the sound of Josiah moving in the main room. Not loud, but present. The scrape of the stove door. The clink of the coffee pot. The soft thud of wood being added to the fire. She lay still for a moment, listening, letting her body remember where she was. Not the convent with its stone walls and the bells that marked every hour. Not the hospital ward with its smells of carbolic and sickness. But a cabin on a mountain far from everything with a man she did not know, and a silence so deep it felt like a physical thing, something you could reach out and touch. She sat up slowly. Her lungs felt tight this morning the way they always did in cold air, but not painful. That was something. She had learned to measure her days by degrees of pain, and this morning registered low manageable. She dressed in the gray wool dress she had worn yesterday, adding a shawl that Mother Superior had given her before she left. The cloth was rough but warm, smelling faintly of the lavender the sisters used to keep moths from the storage chests. When she opened the door, Josiah was standing at the stove, his back to her. He had already dressed, his hair still damp from washing combed back from his forehead. He did not turn when she entered, but his shoulders shifted slightly, acknowledging her presence. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought them to the table. She sat in the chair that faced the window, the same chair she had taken last night, and he sat across from her in the other. They drank in silence, the steam rising between them, the cabin warming degree by degree as the fire found its strength. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky showed clear now, that hard, bright blue that comes only in deep winter at high altitude. The trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with white, their shadows sharp and black against the ground. No wind, no movement, just the cold and the light and the endless quiet. After a while, Josiah stood and moved to the stove. He cracked eggs into a pan, 4 of them, and the smell of butter and heat filled the room. He cut bread from the loaf he had baked and set it to toast on the stovetop. When everything was ready, he brought it to the table on 2 plates, and they ate without speaking, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin and the crackle of the fire. Catherine watched him as she ate. His hands were large and scarred, the kind of hands that came from years of hard work, but they moved with care when he handled the food, deliberate and gentle. His face was weathered, deep lines around his eyes and mouth, his beard more gray than dark. He did not meet her gaze, but she did not think it was from rudeness. More like he had forgotten how to look at people, or maybe he had simply grown used to looking at other things. Trees, snow, the fire. When they finished, she stood and gathered the plates before he could move. "I will wash these," she said. He looked at her for a moment as if deciding whether to argue, then nodded. "Wood box is outside. I will fill it." He pulled on his coat and went out, leaving the door open just long enough for a rush of cold air to sweep through the room before it closed again. Catherine heated water on the stove and washed the dishes carefully, drying each one with a cloth that had been folded and left on the shelf. Everything in the cabin had a place. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was careless. It was the home of a man who had lived alone long enough to create systems that required no one else. She looked around the room as she worked. The table and 2 chairs, the bookshelf with its worn volumes, the bed in the corner neatly made, its blanket pulled tight, and near the window, hanging from a nail on a thin strip of leather, a small wooden cross. She had noticed it last night but had not examined it closely. Now, with the morning light streaming through the window, she could see it better. Cedar by the look of it, hand-carved. The proportions simple but true. The wood worn smooth as if it had been handled often, or perhaps just aged by time and air. She dried her hands and crossed to the window. She reached up and touched the cross with one finger, feeling the texture of the wood, the slight warmth where the sun had been touching it. The carving was skilled but not ornate. Whoever had made it had known what they were doing. "My wife made that." She turned. Josiah had come back inside without her hearing, his arms full of split wood. He crossed to the fire and began stacking the pieces beside the hearth, his movements efficient and practiced. "It is beautiful," Catherine said. She liked to carve. He did not look at her as he spoke, just kept stacking the wood piece by piece. Said it calmed her mind, gave her hands something to do while her thoughts worked themselves out. How long ago did she pass? 8 years. Winter of 77. He finished stacking the wood and stood brushing bark dust from his hands. She got sick. Fever and cough. Could not shake it. One morning she just did not wake up. Catherine was quiet for a moment, still looking at the cross. Then she said, "I am sorry, it was a long time ago. Does time make it easier?" He looked at her, then really looked at her, and his eyes were the color of slate gray and hard, but not unkind. "No," he said, "it just makes it different." They stood there in the growing light, the fire burning between them, the cross turning slowly on its leather cord in the draft from the chimney. After a moment, Josiah turned and went to the door. "I need to check the traps. Will you be all right here?" "Yes. There is wood. There is food. If you need anything, it can wait until I return. I will be fine." He pulled on his coat and hat and left, and the cabin settled back into silence. Catherine stood at the window and watched him walk across the clearing, his boots breaking through the crust of snow, his figure growing smaller as he moved toward the tree line. Then he was gone, swallowed by the pines, and she was alone. She spent the morning exploring the cabin, not with her hands but with her eyes. She did not want to intrude to touch things that were not hers to touch. But she could look. The books on the shelf were a mix of practical guides and literature, a manual on animal husbandry, a volume of Whitman's poetry, its spine cracked from use, Walden by Thoreau, the Bible, its leather cover dark and soft with age. She pulled the Thoreau from the shelf and opened it carefully. On the inside cover, written in a woman's hand, were the words, "For Josiah who already knows how to live deliberately. With love, Sarah." She closed the book gently and returned it to the shelf. Sarah. That had been his wife's name. The woman who had carved the cross. The woman who had lived here and made it a home and then had and left him alone in this silence. Catherine sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the snow. She thought about her own life, the path that had led her here. The convent in Denver had been her home for 7 years, ever since she had left her family's farm in Minnesota. She had been 18 then, tall and awkward, and uncertain of what she wanted except that it was not marriage to any of the boys in town who looked at her and saw only a strong back and hands that could work. The convent had offered something else. Purpose, order. A place where being tall did not matter, where being plain did not matter, where she could be useful without having to be beautiful or small or soft. But the work had been hard. Endless hours in the hospital tending to men and women whose bodies were broken by mining accidents or factory work or simple poverty. The smells of blood and infection and despair. The children they taught hungry and tired, their eyes too old for their faces. She had done the work gladly, believing it mattered, believing she was serving something larger than herself. And then the coughing had started. At first she had ignored it. Everyone coughed in the city, the air thick with coal smoke and dust. But hers had not stopped. It had grown worse, deeper, until she was waking at night, gasping for air, her chest tight and burning. The doctor had examined her and shaken his head. Consumption, he said. Maybe, or something like it. The city air was poison to her lungs. If she stayed, she would die. The only chance was mountain air, high and clean and cold. Mother Superior had written to every contact she had, every place the convent had helped, looking for someone who might take Catherine in. Most had said no. A sick woman was a burden, especially in winter. But then a reply had come from a man named Josiah Wade, a man who had donated timber for the chapel, a man who lived alone on a mountain and had a room to spare. And so here she was, sitting in a stranger's cabin, watching the snow, waiting to see if her lungs would heal or if she had simply come here to die in a different place. She breathed in slowly, testing. The air was cold but clean, sharp with the smell of pine and wood smoke. Her lungs expanded, held released. No cough. Not yet. That was something. Josiah returned near midday, his face red from cold, his coat dusted with snow. He brought with him 2 rabbits already skinned and cleaned, their flesh pale and firm. He hung them from a hook near the door and removed his coat and hat, hanging them beside the rabbits. Then he washed his hands in the basin, the water turning pink with traces of blood. "I can cook those," Catherine said, "if you show me what you have." He nodded and moved to the shelves, pulling down jars and tins, onions, carrots, dried herbs that rattled in their jars. She took them and set to work, moving around the small space with care, learning where things were, how the stove drew, what pots he had. Josiah sat at the table and watched her, not speaking, just observing. She chopped the vegetables with steady hands, her knife work precise. She browned the rabbit in a pot with a bit of lard, then added the vegetables and water and herbs, setting it to simmer on the stove. The smell filled the cabin, slowly rich and savory, and she saw Josiah's shoulders relax slightly, something easing in him. "You cook like someone who has done it before," he said. "I grew up on a farm, 8 children, everyone had to help. We're Minnesota, near St. Cloud, long way from here." Yes, she stirred the pot, adjusting the heat, but not so different. Cold, snow, trees, just fewer people. "You like the quiet." She thought about that for a moment. "I thought I did. In the convent, I thought silence was holy, something to seek. But it was never really silent there, always bells, always prayers, always the sound of other sisters moving through the halls. This is different. How? This is the silence underneath everything else. The silence that was here before people and will be hereafter." She looked at him. Does that sound strange? No, he said. That is exactly what it is. They ate the stew when it was ready, thick and hot, soaking up the broth with bread. The afternoon light slanted through the window, turning the walls golden, and they sat in its warmth and ate slowly, neither of them speaking the silence between them. Not awkward, but simply present, something they were both learning to share. After the meal, Josiah pushed back from the table and said, I want to show you the land, so you know where things are. If you feel up to it, I do. They dressed warmly and stepped outside. The cold was sharp but bearable, the sun bright enough to make the snow almost painful to look at. He led her around the cabin, pointing out the barn, where the horse was kept, the small shed that held tools and extra firewood, the path that led to the creek. His voice was low and even factual, giving her information without elaboration. The well is there, he said, pointing to a stone ring, half buried in snow. Water is good, cold but good. I draw it every morning. He showed her the root cellar built into the side of the hill behind the cabin, its door heavy and fitted with a thick lock. Potatoes, onions, carrots, apples, enough to get through the winter if we are careful. They walked farther, following a trail he had broken through the snow until they reached a small clearing on a rise above the cabin. Here the trees opened up, and you could see down the valley the land falling away in waves of white and dark green, the sky huge and blue and empty above. He stopped and stood looking down. She came to stand beside him, her breath coming harder from the climb, her lungs tight, but not burning. This is where I buried her, he said quietly. Sarah, under that aspen there. Catherine looked. The tree was bare now, its white bark stark against the snow, its branches reaching up like fingers. A simple marker of slate leaned at its base, partially covered by snow. She must have loved this place, Catherine said. She did. She said it was the closest thing to heaven she would see on earth, and you. You believe that? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I believe it is a good place. That is enough. They stood there for a while, neither speaking, just looking out at the valley, the silence so complete that Catherine could hear the blood moving in her own ears. Then Josiah turned and began walking back down the trail, and she followed her boots, finding his tracks, the cabin coming back into view, smoke rising thin and straight from its chimney. That evening, Catherine asked if she could embroider. I brought thread and cloth, she said, if it would not disturb you. It would not. She retrieved a small bundle from her bag and returned to the main room. Josiah was sitting by the fire, a book open in his lap. She settled into the other chair and spread the cloth across her knees. It was a piece of linen, plain and undyed, and she had brought thread in several colors, though mostly she preferred blue and gold. What will you make? He asked. A cover for the cross, she said, to protect it, if that would be all right. He looked at the cross hanging in the window, then back at her. Yes, that would be all right. She threaded her needle, the lamplight making the task easier than it would have been by daylight, and began to work. The first stitches were always the hardest, setting the pattern, finding the rhythm. But after a few minutes her hands remembered, and the needle moved smoothly, pulling the thread through the cloth, the blue taking shape in a simple design of vines and leaves. Josiah watched her work, his book forgotten. After a while he said, You are good at that. I have been doing it since I was a child. My mother taught me. She said every woman should know how to make something beautiful even if her life was hard. Was your life hard? Catherine considered the question, her needle pausing. Not hard in the way some lives are hard. We had food, we had a house, but there were many of us, and my father drank and my mother was tired. Always tired. She died when I was 15. I am sorry. She went peacefully, in her sleep, like Sarah. She resumed her stitching. I think that is a blessing to go that way, not to know it is happening. Josiah nodded but said nothing. The fire crackled between them, and the lamplight pooled on the table, and outside the window the night settled in the stars, beginning to appear cold and distant and impossibly clear. Catherine worked until her eyes grew tired, then set the cloth aside. The design was only partly finished, the vine still incomplete, but there was time. She folded it carefully and returned it to her bag. When she came back to the fire, Josiah was standing at the window looking out at the night. You can see every star up here, she said, coming to stand beside him. Yes, no city lights to drown them out. He pointed. That is Orion. There, his belt and sword. She followed his finger and found the constellation bright and clear. My father used to show me the stars. He said they were the only thing that was the same no matter where you were. You could be anywhere in the world, and they would still be there the same stars. Your father was a wise man, in some ways, in others not so much. They stood there for a moment longer, then Josiah said, "You should sleep. Tomorrow will be another day." "Yes, good night, Josiah." He turned and looked at her, and she saw something shift in his face, some small softening. "Good night, Catherine." She went to her room and closed the door and lay down on the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Through the thin wall, she could hear him moving in the main room, banking the fire, blowing out the lamp. Then his bed creaking as he settled into it. Then nothing but the wind and the cabin breathing around them. She closed her eyes and thought about the day, the stew she had made, the walk to the clearing, the cross she was embroidering. Small things, simple things, but they felt important in a way she could not name, like she was building something piece by piece, stitch by stitch in this place that was so far from everything she had known. The days that followed took on a pattern, a rhythm that was both new and strangely familiar. Each morning began the same way. Josiah woke first, built the fire, made the coffee. Catherine woke to the sounds of him moving dressed and joined him at the table. They drank their coffee in silence, watching the light change outside the window, the dawn coming slow and cold and beautiful. After breakfast, Josiah would go out to tend to the horse, or check the traps or split wood, and Catherine would clean the cabin or cook or work on her embroidery. Sometimes she read from the books on the shelf, losing herself in Thoreau's careful observations of nature or Whitman's sprawling verse. Sometimes she simply sat by the window and watched the snow, learning its moods, the way it could look blue in shadow and gold in sunlight, the way it could seem both soft and hard, forgiving and merciless. At midday, they would eat together whatever Catherine had prepared. Soup from dried beans and bacon, biscuits with honey, fried potatoes with onions. The meals were simple but filling, and they ate without much conversation, the silence between them growing more comfortable with each passing day. In the afternoons, Josiah began to teach her about the mountain, how to read the weather by the shape of the clouds and the direction of the wind, how to tell if the creek was safe to cross by the sound of the water moving under the ice, how to stack wood so it would dry properly and burn clean. He did not explain why he was teaching her these things, and she did not ask. She simply learned, storing the knowledge away, understanding that it might be the difference between life and death if something happened to him and she was left alone. One afternoon, perhaps a week after she arrived, he brought her to the woodpile and handed her an axe. Smaller than the one he used, but still heavy, the handle worn smooth by years of use. "You should know how to split wood," he said. She took the axe, feeling its weight, the balance of it. "All right." He set a round of pine on the chopping block and stepped back. "Aim for the center. Let the weight of the axe do the work. Do not force it." She lifted the axe, surprised by how heavy it was, and swung. The blade hit the wood off-center and stuck without splitting it. She tried to pull it free, but it would not budge. Josiah stepped forward and worked the axe loose. Again he said, "But this time do not think about it. Just swing." She swung again. The blade hit closer to the center, and the wood cracked but did not split. Again. This time the wood split clean, the two halves falling to either side. She looked up at him, surprised and pleased. "Good," he said, again. She split 5 more rounds before her arms began to shake with exhaustion. Josiah took the axe from her and set it aside. "That is enough for today." That night her shoulders ached and her hands were sore where blisters were forming. But she felt something else too, a satisfaction, a sense of competence. She had done something she had not thought she could do. The next day she asked Josiah if he would like to learn to embroider. He looked at her as if she had suggested he learn to fly. "I do not think my hands are made for such work." "Your hands made this cabin," she said. "They can make small stitches." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, if you think it possible." She gave him a scrap of cloth and a needle threaded with blue. She showed him how to hold the needle, how to push it through the cloth, and pull it back, how to keep the tension even so the thread did not bunch or pull. His hands were too large, his fingers too thick, and the needle looked absurd in his grasp, like a toy. But he tried, his brow furrowed in concentration, his movements slow and careful. After 20 minutes, he had managed 5 crooked stitches that wandered across the cloth like a drunk man walking home. He held it up and looked at it, then at her. "This is terrible," he said. She could not help it. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since arriving, and the sound surprised both of them. It is not terrible. It is a start. He almost smiled. You are a kind liar. I am not lying. Look. She took the cloth and examined it closely. Your stitches are even. That is the most important thing. The rest is just practice. He set the cloth aside and shook his head. I think I will stay with axes. But 3 nights later, she found him sitting by the fire with the cloth in his lap, working another line of stitches by lamplight. He did not say anything, and neither did she. She simply sat down and worked on her own embroidery, the cross cover she was making, and they stitched together in silence until the fire burned low and it was time to sleep. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The snow continued to fall not every day, but often enough that the world stayed white and cold and silent. Catherine's cough did not return. Her breathing grew stronger. She could walk farther without feeling winded, could work longer without needing to rest. The mountain air, clean and sharp and merciless, was doing what the doctor had said it might. It was healing her. One evening as they sat by the fire, Josiah said, "You are stronger now. I can see it. I feel it," she said. "I think the doctor was right. This place is helping." He nodded, then after a moment said, "I am glad you came." She looked at him surprised. He was not a man who said such things easily. "So am I," she said quietly. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. It was warmer, somehow more complete, as if they had finally arrived at a place where words were not necessary, where presence was enough. That night, Catherine finished the cover for the cross. The embroidery was simple, but precise blue vines curling around a border of gold, the center left open for the cross itself. She held it up to the lamplight, checking for any missed stitches, any imperfections. Finding none, she folded it carefully and set it aside. Tomorrow she would show Josiah and ask if he wanted her to put it on the cross, or if he preferred to do it himself, or if he would rather leave the cross as it was bare and smooth and worn by Sarah's hands. She went to her room and lay down the quilt pulled up and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling for the night. Josiah moving in the main room, the fire sighing, the wind pushing against the walls, and underneath it all, the deeper silence of the mountain, vast and patient and unending. She thought about Sarah, the woman who had lived here before her, the woman who had carved the cross and planted herbs and made this rough cabin into a home. She did not feel like she was intruding on Sarah's memory. It was stranger than that. She felt like she was continuing something Sarah had started, like she was the next verse in a song that had paused but not ended. She wondered what Sarah would have thought of her. This tall woman from Minnesota who had come to the mountain to heal, who cooked and cleaned and split wood and embroidered covers for crosses. Would Sarah have liked her? Would they have been friends, or would Sarah have been jealous, protective of the space she had made, unwilling to share even in death? Catherine did not know. But she hoped in some quiet place inside herself that Sarah would have understood, that Sarah would have seen what Catherine was beginning to see, that this man Josiah, who lived alone on this mountain, who had built walls of silence around his grief, was not meant to be alone forever. That grief was not meant to be carried solo until the end. That healing for both of them might mean learning to share the silence instead of hiding in it. The next morning, she brought the cover to Josiah. He was sitting at the table drinking his coffee, and he looked up as she approached. She set the cloth down in front of him. "I finished it," she said. He picked it up carefully, his rough fingers gentle on the embroidery. He examined it for a long time, tracing the vines with one finger, holding it up to the light. Then he looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "It is beautiful," he said. "Thank you. Shall I put it on the cross?" "No," he said. "I will do it, if that is all right." Of course, he stood and crossed to the window, taking the cross down from its nail. He slipped it into the embroidered cover, adjusting it until it sat centered, the blue and gold framing the simple cedar wood. Then he hung it back on the nail, and they stood together, looking at it. The cross looked different now, still simple, still honest, but also cared for, protected, honored. Sarah's work and Catherine's work together. "She would have liked this," Josiah said quietly. "Sarah. She would have liked that someone thought to care for it." "I hope so," he turned to her. "I know so." They went about their day, then the same rhythms and patterns they had established. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. They were no longer two strangers sharing a space out of necessity. They were something else. Not family, Not friends quite, but something that might become either or both given time. That afternoon, it began to snow again. Not the light dustings they had been getting, but a real storm, the kind that turns the world into nothing but white and wind and cold. They watched it come from the window, the sky darkening to the wind rising, the snow falling so thick you could not see the tree line. "We will be snowed in for a few days," Josiah said. "Maybe more. You are not afraid." "No," Catherine said. "I have wood. I have food. I have good company. What is there to fear?" He looked at her, and something passed between them, something wordless and true. Then he turned back to the window, and they watched the storm come together, the fire warm at their backs, the cabin solid around them. And Catherine thought that perhaps this was what Sarah had meant when she said this place was the closest thing to heaven she would see on earth. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. Because the silence here did not hide things. It revealed them. And what it was revealing, slowly, patiently, was that neither of them had to be invisible anymore. That they could be seen, truly seen, and that being seen was not something to fear. It was something to welcome. The snow fell, the fire burned, they breathed, and the mountain held them both steady and sure as the world outside turned white and the light faded and the long night began. The storm lasted 3 days. On the first day, the snow fell steady and thick, covering the world in layers that built upon themselves until the cabin window showed only white pressed against the glass. And the door, when Josiah opened it to bring in more wood, revealed a wall of snow nearly to his waist that he had to push through with his shoulder to reach the woodpile on the porch. The wind came in gusts that shook the cabin walls and found every crack and gap, whistling through in thin voices that sounded almost human, almost like singing, and the cold pressed in from all sides despite the fire that Josiah kept burning high and hot, feeding it log after log, until the stone chimney glowed with heat and the air near the hearth shimmered. Catherine sat by the window wrapped in a quilt and watched the snow fall. She had never seen anything like this in Minnesota, where storms came fast and mean, but then moved on, leaving the sky clear and hard. This was different. This snow fell as if it had all the time in the world, as if it would never stop, as if stopping was not even a concept it understood. She watched the flakes, each one visible for a moment against the gray sky, before it joined the mass of white below, and she thought about how something so small and delicate could become in great numbers, something powerful enough to bury a cabin, to stop all travel, to make the world disappear. Josiah moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, doing the small tasks that needed doing. He filled the water bucket from the barrel he kept inside for just such storms. He sorted through the food stores, taking stock of what they had, making calculations in his head about how long it would last. He checked the door and windows for drafts and stuffed rags into the gaps where the wind was getting through. He did not speak much, but his presence was steady, a kind of anchor in the storm, and Catherine found it comforting to watch him work, to see his large hands moving with such care and precision. That evening, they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and afterward, Catherine took out her embroidery while Josiah sat with his book, though she noticed he did not turn many pages, his eyes more often on the fire than on the words. The lamplight pooled golden on the table between them, and the fire crackled and popped, and outside the wind howled, and the snow fell and fell and fell. She worked on a new piece, something she had not planned but felt drawn to make. A second cover, this one smaller, a pouch really, that could hold the cross when it needed to be taken down or moved. She used dark blue thread on gray linen stitching, a pattern of mountains and stars. Simple shapes that grew under her needle row by row, the rhythm of the work soothing, meditative, her breath falling into time with the movement of her hands. Josiah watched her work, and after a long silence he said, "My mother used to sew like that. Not embroidery, just mending. But she had the same look you do when she worked, like she was somewhere else." "Where was she?" Catherine asked, not looking up from her stitching. "Iowa originally. Then they moved west when I was young, looking for land. Found it in Colorado near the mountains. My father thought he could farm, but the land was too hard, too dry. He died trying to prove it wrong." "And your mother?" "She died a year after him. I think she just got tired. Tired of fighting the land, tired of being alone, tired of everything. She went to sleep one night and did not wake up, same as Sarah, same as your mother. Maybe that is the kindest way to go, when the body just decides it has had enough and lets go quietly." Catherine nodded, her needle pausing for a moment. Do you think they knew that they were going to die that night? I do not know. I hope not. I hope it was just sleep and then nothing. No fear, no pain, just a quiet end. They were silent for a while, the fire burning between them. And then Catherine said, I used to be afraid of dying. When I first got sick, when the coughing would not stop, I was so afraid. Not of being dead, but of the moment of dying, of feeling myself slip away. But now, after being here, after seeing how quiet everything is, how the mountain just keeps breathing, whether we are here or not, I am not afraid anymore. Death seems like just another kind of silence, and silence is not something to fear. No, Josiah said quietly, it is not. On the second day, the snow continued, though the wind had lessened, and the cabin felt less besieged, more simply held in the storm's embrace. They woke to find frost on the inside of the windows, intricate patterns like ferns and feathers that caught the gray morning light and made the glass look like something magical, something from a story. Catherine stood at the window and traced the patterns with her finger, feeling the cold bite of the glass, watching her fingertip leave a trail through the frost that quickly began to refreeze. The day passed slowly, measured not in hours but in small actions. Coffee made and drunk, bread baked the cabin filling with its warm yeast smell. Wood carried in from the porch, the snow now so high that Josiah had to dig a tunnel through it to reach the stack. The fire fed and tended its light, the only real warmth in the world. Catherine read from Walden the words about solitude and simplicity, resonating in a way they never had before, and she thought that Thoreau had been right, that there was something essential about stripping life down to its basics, to fire and food and shelter, and the company of one other human soul. In the afternoon, Josiah taught her how to make coffee the way he liked it, strong and bitter, boiling the grounds right in the water and then letting them settle before pouring. She watched his hands measure the grounds, 3 heaping spoonfuls for the pot, and she tried to memorize the gesture, the amount, understanding, without him saying it, that he was teaching her in case something happened to him, in case she needed to survive here alone. The thought should have frightened her, but it did not. She felt capable now, strong in a way she had never felt in the city, as if the mountain was teaching her what her body could do, what her spirit could endure. That evening they sat by the fire again, and Catherine finished the pouch for the cross. She held it up to the lamplight, checking the stitches, and satisfied with her work, she folded it and set it aside. Tomorrow she would give it to Josiah, but tonight she wanted to simply sit and feel the accomplishment of completing something, of making something useful and beautiful in the midst of this white isolation. Josiah had fallen asleep in his chair, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open, his breath coming deep and even. Catherine looked at him in the firelight and saw how the years had marked him, the lines around his eyes, the gray in his beard, the scars on his hands. But she also saw something else, something that had not been there when she first arrived. A softening, a relaxation, as if the walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack, to let light in, to let another person in. She stood quietly and took the quilt from her shoulders and laid it over him, tucking it gently around his chest and arms. He did not wake, just shifted slightly and settled deeper into sleep. She banked the fire for the night, covering the logs with ash so they would burn slow and low until morning, and then she went to her room and closed the door and lay down in the darkness, listening to his breathing through the wall, the sound as steady as the ticking of a clock, and she felt for the first time since leaving the convent, truly safe. On the third day, the snow stopped. Catherine woke to silence, a silence so complete and profound that at first she thought something was wrong, that the world had ended in the night, and she was the only one left. But then she heard it underneath the silence, the small sounds of the cabin living, the creak of timber settling, the whisper of ash shifting in the fireplace, Josiah's breathing still asleep in the main room. She rose and dressed and opened her door. The cabin was dim. The fire burned down to coals, but through the window she could see light, real light, the sun coming up somewhere beyond the peaks to the east. She crossed to the window and looked out, and what she saw took her breath away. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear. A blue so deep and pure, it looked like something you could fall into, and the snow lay everywhere, covering everything, smoothing the world into soft curves and gentle slopes, and the light, the morning light, struck the snow and turned it into something that glowed, that shimmered, that looked like the surface of some vast frozen ocean. The trees were buried to their middles, only their tops visible, dark green against all that white, and the cabin sat like a small island in the midst of it all alone, but not lonely, held safe by the mountain's great white hand. Catherine stood at the window for a long time, just looking, just breathing, and she felt something shift inside her, something open. This was why she had come. Not just for the clean air, though that was part of it. Not just to survive the sickness, though that was part of it too. But for this. For moments like this, when the world revealed itself in all its terrible beauty, when you understood that you were small and brief and that was all right, that was good, that being small meant you could be held by something larger, something that would outlast you and everyone you knew. And there was comfort in that, comfort in knowing that the mountain would still be here long after she was gone. Josiah woke and found her at the window. He came to stand beside her, the quilt she had covered him with still wrapped around his shoulders, and they stood together, looking out at the transformed world. "Beautiful," she said. "Yes. Have you ever seen it like this before?" "Once. The winter after Sarah died. I woke up to find the world covered everything white and new, and I thought it was the mountain's way of saying that grief does not last forever, that everything gets covered eventually, that there is always another season coming." "Do you still believe?" That he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am starting to." They spent the morning digging out. Josiah took a shovel and began clearing a path from the door to the woodpile, then from the woodpile to the barn. The snow was deep chest high in places, and the work was hard, exhausting, but necessary. Catherine helped as much as she could, though her strength was still not what it had been before the sickness, and after an hour, Josiah made her go inside to rest. She watched him through the window, his figure dark against the white, the shovel rising and falling, the path growing longer, and she thought about strength, about how it could be measured, not just in what you could lift or carry, but in what you could endure and showing up day after day to do the work that needed doing. That afternoon, they were finally able to check on the horse. The barn had held against the storm, and Lucy was fine standing in her stall, calm and patient, waiting for hay and water. Josiah tended to her while Catherine stood in the barn doorway, breathing in the smell of horse and straw and old wood, a smell that reminded her of her childhood, of her father's farm, of a time before she understood how hard the world could be. The days that followed the storm were quiet in a different way, not the silence of being trapped, but the silence of recovery, of settling. The sun came out strong and bright, and the snow began to melt where it touched the cabin walls, dripping from the eaves in a steady rhythm that sounded almost like rain. Icicles formed along the roof edge, long and clear and sharp, catching the light and throwing it back in rainbow colors. Catherine stood beneath them and watched the water drip, each drop catching the sun for a moment before falling to the snow below. And she thought about time, about how it moved, whether you wanted it to or not, about how each moment was like those drops of water, brief and beautiful, and then gone. She fell into the rhythms of the cabin more deeply, now her body learning what needed to be done, and when her hands growing more skilled at the small tasks that kept them alive. She learned to read the fire to know when it needed more wood and when it just needed air. She learned to bake bread that rose properly, the crust golden and crisp, the inside soft and warm. She learned to move through the small space without bumping into Josiah, to anticipate where he would be and give him room, and he learned the same with her until they moved around each other, like dancers who had practiced the steps so many times they no longer needed to think about them. One evening, perhaps 2 weeks after the storm, Catherine had a memory of her mother that came to her unbidden as she sat by the fire working on a new piece of embroidery, this one a simple border of flowers for a pillowcase. She was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in their farmhouse in Minnesota, watching her mother prepare supper. It was winter then, snow falling outside the window, the kitchen warm from the stove. Her mother was humming something, a tune Catherine could not quite remember now, and her hands moved with such certainty, peeling potatoes, chopping onions, stirring the pot, and young Catherine had asked her, "How do you know what to do?" And her mother had stopped and looked at her and smiled and said, "You just do it enough times and your hands remember, and then you do not have to think anymore, you just do, and that is when you know you are home." Catherine understood now what her mother had meant. Her hands knew how to move in this cabin, knew where the cups were kept, where the thread was stored, how much wood to add to the fire. Her body knew when to wake and when to sleep, when to work and when to rest. She was home, not in the sense of the place where she was born, but in the sense of the place where she belonged, where her hands remembered where she did not have to think. She looked up from her embroidery and found Josiah watching her, his book closed in his lap. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "My mother," she said. "How she told me that home is where your hands remember what to do." He nodded slowly. Sarah used to say something similar. She said, "Home is not a place, but a feeling. And you know it when your body relaxes, when you stop holding yourself ready to run. Have you felt that?" "Since I came," he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "Yes, I have." The silence that followed was full complete, like something solid you could hold in your hand. Outside, the wind had picked up again, not the violent wind of the storm, but a gentler wind, a wind that spoke of changes coming, of seasons turning of time, moving forward whether they were ready or not. Another week passed, and then another, and the snow began to recede, not melting so much as compacting, settling, becoming part of the earth again. The days grew incrementally longer, the sun rising a few minutes earlier, each morning, setting a few minutes later each evening, and you could feel it in the air. The coming of spring still far off, but approaching, inevitable as breathing. Catherine's health continued to improve. The tightness in her chest was gone, her breathing easy and full, and she could walk for hours now without tiring, could work all day without needing to rest. The mountain had healed her, or maybe it was not the mountain at all, but something else. Something about learning to live simply, about stripping away everything that was not essential, and finding that what remained was enough, was more than enough. One morning she woke before Josiah, which almost never happened, and she lay in her bed listening to him sleep, his breathing deep and slow through the wall, and she thought about what her life had become. She had left the convent expecting to die, or at least expecting to spend her final months in misery and pain, a burden to whoever was kind enough to take her in. But that was not what had happened. Instead, she had found this place, this man, this life of fire and bread and embroidery and snow, and she had found that she did not want to leave, not when spring came, not ever. She wanted to stay. She wanted to build something here, something lasting, something that would outlive her the way Sarah's cross had outlived Sarah. But she did not know if Josiah wanted that. He had said he was glad she had come, but that was not the same as asking her to stay. And she did not know how to ask him, did not know how to put into words what she was feeling. This sense that they were building something together, something fragile but real, something worth protecting. She rose and dressed and went to the main room. Josiah was still asleep, and she moved quietly so as not to wake him. She built up the fire and made coffee and stood at the window watching the sunrise, the light spilling down the mountainside, turning the snow from white to gold. And she thought that whatever happened, whatever came next, she would always remember this. The silence, the light, the sense of being held by something larger than herself. When Josiah woke, they drank their coffee in silence, as had become their custom. And then he said, "I want to show you something. If you feel strong enough for a walk, I do." They dressed warmly and set out following a path he had broken through the snow that led up the mountain, climbing steadily through the trees. The air was cold but not brutal, and the sky was clear, and Catherine felt her lungs expand with each breath, felt her body strong and capable, and she thought that a few months ago this walk would have been impossible, would have left her gasping and coughing and weak. But now she climbed with ease, her legs strong, her breath steady. They climbed for perhaps 30 minutes, and then the trees opened up, and they were standing in a clearing at the top of a rise, and from here, you could see down the valley, the land falling away in waves, the mountains rising in the distance, peak after peak after peak, blue, blue, and white and endless. The wind was stronger up here, pulling at their clothes, cold against their faces, but it felt good clean, like it was washing something away. "This is the highest point on my land," Josiah said. "I come here when I need to think, when I need to remember how small I am, how little any of my worries matter in the face of all this." "It is beautiful," Catherine said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Sarah wanted to be buried here, but the ground was too hard, too rocky. So I put her under the aspen instead, lower down. But I always thought this was the place she would have chosen if she could have. Why? Because from here you can see everything, the valley, the mountains, the sky. You can see how it all fits together, how nothing is separate, how the trees need the mountain and the mountain needs the snow and the snow needs the clouds and the clouds need the wind." She liked that, understanding how things connected. Catherine nodded, and they stood there for a long time, just looking, just breathing. and she understood why Josiah had brought her here. He was showing her something important, something true about himself, about this place, about what mattered to him. And in showing her, he was letting her in, letting her see him, not as the silent mountain man who lived alone, but as someone who thought deeply, who felt deeply, who understood that connection was what made life bearable. Finally, he turned to her and said, I do not know what will happen when spring comes. I do not know if you will want to stay or if you will need to return to the convent. But I want you to know that if you want to stay, there is a place for you here, not as a guest, as someone who belongs. Catherine felt her throat tighten, her eyes sting with tears that came not from sadness, but from something else, something like relief, like gratitude, like joy. I want to stay, she said. If you will have me, I will have you, he said simply, for as long as you want to be here. They stood there on the high-rise with the wind pulling at them, and the valley spread out below and the sun bright on the snow, and Catherine thought that this was what her mother had meant about home. This feeling in her chest, this sense of rightness, of belonging, of her body finally relaxing because she no longer needed to hold herself ready to run. They walked back down the mountain together, and when they reached the cabin, the smoke was still rising from the chimney, steady and sure, a promise that there was warmth waiting inside, that there was a place that was theirs, that would hold them through whatever came next. That evening, Catherine took the pouch she had made for the cross and gave it to Josiah. He took it carefully, examining the stitching, the pattern of mountains and stars, and he looked at her with something in his eyes that might have been tenderness, might have been gratitude, might have been both. Thank you, he said, for this, for all of it. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and they sat by the fire as the light outside faded from gold to pink to purple to dark, and the stars began to appear one by one, cold and distant and beautiful. And the cabin settled around them, holding them both. And Catherine thought that this was enough. This was everything. This fire and this silence and this man who had opened his home and his life to a stranger and made her belong. The days grew longer. The snow continued to melt slowly, patiently, revealing the brown earth beneath the dead grass, the rocks and roots, and all the hidden things that winter had covered. Birds began to return, small brown things that hopped from branch to branch, their songs tentative at first, and then growing stronger, more confident, filling the mornings with sound. The creek began to run again, the ice breaking up and floating downstream, and you could hear it if you stood outside and listened, the water rushing and tumbling over stones alive after months of silence. One afternoon in early March, Catherine was sitting on the porch wrapped in a quilt, watching the light change on the mountains, when Josiah came and sat beside her. They sat in silence for a while, and then he said, Spring will be here soon. Yes. Are you ready for it? She thought about that. Ready for the world to wake up, for the green to return, for the days to grow warm and long. Ready for the convent to send word asking when she would return. Ready for decisions and changes and all the complications that came with not being isolated anymore. I do not know, she said honestly. Part of me wants winter to last forever. I know what you mean. There is something about winter that makes everything simple. You only have to worry about staying warm, staying fed, staying alive. Spring brings choices, and choices are hard. Do you regret asking me to stay? He looked at her surprised. No, never. Do you regret saying yes? No. Good. He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm warm against hers, and they sat like that holding hands, watching the light fade and the stars emerge. And Catherine thought that this was what love looked like, not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but this two people sitting together in silence, holding on, choosing each other, day after day after day. The sun set, the sky turned from blue to purple to black. The first stars appeared bright and cold, and then more and more until the sky was full of them, countless thousands, and Catherine tilted her head back and looked up and thought about her father, showing her the stars when she was young, telling her they were the same, no matter where you were, and she understood now what he had meant. The stars were constant. They were the thing you could count on when everything else changed. They were home. Josiah went inside and lit the lamp, and the warm light spilled out through the window, golden and inviting, and Catherine stood and went inside, leaving the cold night behind, stepping into the warmth, into the light, into the life they were building together one day, one choice, one moment at a time. They ate a simple supper of soup and bread, and afterward, Catherine worked on her embroidery, while Josiah whittled a small piece of wood, shaping it into something she could not tell what yet, his knife moving slowly, carefully, shaving away thin curls that fell to the floor like snow. The fire burned low. The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, a soft sound, a lullaby. And Catherine's eyes grew heavy, her needle slowing, her breathing deepening. She set aside her work and stood. "I am tired," she said. "Good night, Josiah. Good night, Catherine." She went to her room and lay down and pulled the quilt up to her chin, and she listened to Josiah moving in the main room, banking the fire, blowing out the lamp, settling into his bed. And then there was only darkness, and the sound of breathing, his and hers, steady and slow, and the cabin breathing with them, in and out, in and out. And she closed her eyes and let herself drift, let herself fall into sleep, like falling into water, soft and deep and safe. Outside, the stars turned slowly in their ancient paths. The moon rose thin and pale, casting silver light on the snow. The wind moved through the valley, carrying with it the scent of pine and distance and the promise of spring still far off but coming, always coming. The creek ran beneath its breaking ice. The trees stood patient and still, and the cabin sat small and dark against the mountain smoke, no longer rising from its chimney. The fire burned down to nothing. The people inside asleep, dreaming their separate dreams that were also somehow the same dream, a dream of home and healing and the quiet grace of being known. The mountain held them. The night held them. The stars held them. And in the darkness, in the silence underneath all other silences, there was only breath. In, out. Slow, steady. The rhythm of two hearts beating in time, two lives joined not by words or promises or anything so fragile, but by the simple fact of presence, of showing up, of choosing again and again to stay. The wind moved through the pine trees, a whisper, a suai, a song without words. The snow lay soft on the ground, melting slowly, feeding the earth, preparing for what would come next. The cross hung in the window, wrapped now in its embroidered cover, blue and gold in the starlight, turning slowly on its leather cord, casting shadows that moved across the walls, like something alive, like wings, like grace. And Catherine slept, and Josiah slept, and the cabin slept, and the mountain slept. And the world turned on its axis, patient and sure, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the darkness held everything gently, the way a mother holds a sleeping child. And there was no fear, no worry, no doubt, only this moment, and this breath, and this peace that passes. Understanding this silence that is not empty, but full, so full, it could hold the whole world and still have room for more. The fire was ash now, cold and gray. But morning would come, it always did, and there would be new wood to burn, new bread to bake, new work to do. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was only sleep, only breath, only the soft dark and the cold stars, and two people who had found in the midst of winter, in the midst of silence, in the midst of loss and sickness, and all the hard things life brings, something that felt like home. The wind quieted. The trees were still. The creek ran beneath its ice, patient, knowing spring would come, that the ice would break, that the water would run free again. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight there was only this. The mountain breathing, the cabin breathing, two people breathing, in, out, slow, deep, the rhythm of life itself, steady and sure. And underneath it all, underneath everything, a silence so profound it was almost like music, like the stars singing, like the snow falling without sound, like grace made visible, made real, made simple as breath. Sleep, rest, home.